If we can get to a stage where regulation faces the same level of scrutiny as taxing and spending, I believe we can massively improve our political culture and New Zealanders' welfare. For 80 years, politicians have said, look, you give us a third to half your income and we'll make all the problems go away. I refuse to believe that 1 in 6 New Zealanders are genuinely unable to work at any given time. It's just not the case. It can't be real. If 1.2 million Brits left in a year, you'd be saying, well, there's something going wrong here. So we certainly, I think, are feeling the pinch in migration patterns. These unionists believe they have the right to do that at the expense of the taxpayer and, more importantly, the children. But anyway, that's a fight worth having.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum, Director of Communications here, and today I'm joined by a very special guest all the way from New Zealand, David Seymour. David Seymour is New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Regulation and leader of the ACT Party. David, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show, Callum.
Thanks for coming all this way just to speak to us.
Absolutely, anytime. Well, you guys just whenever you need me.
I appreciate it. Look, let's get straight into it. I think what would be really helpful for me and for our listeners and viewers is for you to give us a bit of an analysis. We are the Institute of Economic Affairs. We're interested in solving the biggest economic problems. What to you is the number one biggest economic challenge facing New Zealand at the moment?
This probably sounds a bit quaint, but it's productivity. We are in what we call the lower left corner of countries that started with poor productivity 10, 20, 30 years ago, and yet have made some of the least progress to improve that over the time period. So that is a really big challenge. How do you get activity that is close to the technology frontier so that you can pay higher wages? And there's a number of problems, and one of them is scale, effective market size, pools of capital. All those things are quite small. So where you tend to get closer to the frontier is summed up by a great New Zealander who wrote Our Strength Lies in the Weird Stuff. So, for example, Sir Peter Beck with Rocket Lab, who would have thought that New Zealand would have a space program, but one extraordinary individual has made that possible. We also had, a company that was making electric fences to keep cattle in. They now make security programs, which is helping, among other things, keep people inside prisons and buildings. So they've gone from animal security to human security. And I could give you a few more examples. Xero, the accounting software. So what tends to happen is that there are these really unexpected niches where you can get closer to the frontier. But those are all household name companies. They are exceptions. The real challenge is to raise productivity by getting more of that type of activity.
And big question, but how do you do that?
Well, there's been a lot of different theories. A lot of people go along and they get all their Michael Porter stuff, and they say if we could just pick a thing to be really good at and create a centre of excellence. The difficulty with that, of course, is that as soon as something looks big enough and interesting enough for politicians to be aware of it, chances are that it's about 10 years past. So recently there's been some quite amusing efforts to try and promote a video game industry in New Zealand, which would be awesome, but it kind of happened 10, 20 years ago in the rest of the world. So that's not a starter in my view. There are people who say that, well, if only we had some sort of scheme just to fund these potential winners, but it's always very difficult to identify the point where government can invest in a particular business and get it right when the rest of the capital markets have got it wrong. That seems like an unlikely thing to happen, so those haven't worked very well. What that leaves you with is trying to create a level playing field of the rule of law, low transaction cost, really light regulation that is addressed only at genuine market failures, a few barriers to foreign capital entering the country, and ideally good investment in skills. So you've got people who are able to adopt new technologies and get closer to the frontier. So really the prescription is a very modest one. Be a good regulator, be a good educator, have a light touch on the fiscals, and you might be surprised what occurs.
Sounds like a pretty Hayekian diagnosis and prescription there.
Oh, well, I'm very proud you've recognised that.
It's not often, especially in the UK, that we hear from politicians who who would channel that way of thinking and that level of that sort of approach, if you like. Now, but you're in government, you're Minister for Regulation, and one of your sort of landmark bits of work is the Regulatory Standards Bill.
Yeah.
I'm just going to quote a little bit of your own press release back to you, if you don't mind, and then
Sure.
jump into a bit of the questioning. The Regulatory Standards Bill will establish a benchmark for good regulation through a set of regulatory principles based on good lawmaking and economic efficiency. Now, a lot of libertarians, not all, but a lot, would argue there's no such thing as good regulation. That's just the best regulation is no regulation. So what is your interpretation of good regulation? What are those principles that underpin it?
Okay, well, a couple of things. First of all, it's not really my bill. This is something that various people in New Zealand have worked on for over 20 years, so I'm just holding it. A custodian, well, yes, and hopefully the person who will soon get it over the line for good. In terms of why do I think that there needs to be some regulation? Well, I think there are examples where, the tragedy of the commons, for example. I'm not aware of anywhere that people have privately solved the tragedy of the commons. There may be examples of that, but I just look at New Zealand's experience. Our fisheries hit an all-time low in the 80s. We introduced a quota management system. We've subsequently had a real regrowth in biomass, and the fishing industry has become a hugely powerful driver of export receipts and jobs for New Zealanders, as well as delicious fish for those of us who enjoy it. So, that's a good example, a tragedy of the commons, and they're all through the environmental sector. I think there's also issues around information and uncertainty. So yes, you could imagine a certification regime emerging for restaurants where you only go to the ones that have the big tick. But sometimes you just think, wouldn't it be easier if the council just said we're going to have some basic hygiene standards in commercial kitchens? I mean, you can argue about that, but it seems like a lot of work to take the kind of anarcho-capitalist position on that, when in reality, regulation can often lower transaction costs. I mean, I notice you have coasts out on the wall, which is great, and I think a lot of people in their sort of zealotry to promote markets forget that some of us just want an easy life with less transaction costs. So I think it's important to recognise the role that regulation can play in just simplifying choice sometimes. But that's the answer about why you might need some regulation. Anyway.
So then, what are you talk about the sort of principles setting in law? Is that right? Some principles that underlie good regulation. What are those principles?
So the principles are liberties. So you should not diminish a person's liberty unless it's to secure the liberty of another person. Property rights. You should not impair property rights unless compensation is given. You certainly shouldn't take property unless compensation is given. We should preserve the decision-making role of the courts. We should preserve the rule of law, equality before the law, easily accessible. So all kind of common law things that you would expect. And there's also good lawmaking. So we talk about problem definition. Can you identify a market failure? Can you identify the costs and benefits of the intervention? Do the benefits exceed the cost? Do the costs fall unfairly on some, particularly in the case of impairment of property? Once you have identified all of that, then you're in a position to decide, do you want to proceed with this law? And if the law you're proposing is not compliant with these principles, you can still do it. The whole purpose of this bill, much like our Fiscal Responsibility Act, much like our Reserve Bank Act, is not to stop politicians doing stupid things. I mean, often they feel they've been elected to do that, and I'm not going to stop them. The purpose is simply to ensure that the voters have an easier time monitoring it. This is really founded in public choice. We want to reduce the cost of gathering information to monitor bad regulators so that voters can punish them and we get better regulation over time.
So there's a big transparency element then.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how will that actually work in practice? The sort of the shining. It give me sort of potentially, if you can, a theoretical example or metaphorical example of how this would work in practice. How voters would be able to see what a new law proposes does and why it might not work, and then how things would happen from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So a good example is in 2010 and 2011, there were a series of really devastating earthquakes which destroyed a major city in the South Island of New Zealand called Christchurch. And one of the biggest tragedies in New Zealand history, 151 people died in that tragedy. By 2016, the government was regulating earthquake standards on buildings right across the country, which have shuttered buildings in provincial towns up and down New Zealand. The cost of the required upgrades is tens of billions. People find themselves stranded because they can't sell the thing, but they also can't afford to upgrade it. It's been a total disaster. And what you've got to remember is that in spite of New Zealand's reputation for being the Shaky Isles, and in spite of the really serious tragedy occurred in Christchurch, fewer than 500 New Zealanders have died in earthquakes in the history of our country. So, unfortunately, I'm also responsible for pharmaceuticals in this country. We have a death rate from cancer that exceeds that, monthly. So, we have imposed enormous costs upon ourselves, and there simply was not the emphasis on what was being done and what the costs were. There was a regulatory impact statement at the time. It did show the costs exceeded the benefits by a stupendous multiple, but it wasn't taken seriously. And we need to elevate this idea of good lawmaking to be as important as balancing the budget.
So when you look at the costs, will there be sort of serious work done to show exactly in a sort of to give a nice round number for what the cost would be, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
Well, I think you have to be realistic about what you know and what you don't know. It may be in some instances that you simply can't calculate the cost, but the important thing here is being transparent. If you say that you're going to put a whole lot of restraint on people and their property, and you don't even know what the cost will be, then people will criticise that. Ironically, the bill itself is being criticised for that reason, because, of course, we don't know what the costs and benefits of changing political behaviour over many decades will be, so we haven't tried to calculate that.
Right, yeah.
But nonetheless, one of the reasons people are sceptical about the bill is that they've been told that they don't know what it will cost or what its benefits will be.
I asked that because we have in this country a bit of a problem sometimes with impact assessments and that sort of thing, not really taking into account everything it possibly could. And obviously there are elements of things that can't possibly be. But we did a piece of work here at the IEA last year, just before the general election. We looked at all the political party manifestos, and there's always a big push around manifestos to be fully costed, especially in recent years. So if you propose a sort of a spending policy or a tax cut or whatever, there's you won't really get it very far in the public perception, at least, if there isn't at least some semblance of fully costing that. But that's on the fiscal measures. There's no work done on the cost of regulation in the same way. It's certainly not in the sort of political manifesto general election arena. So it's very easy to say, oh, we will impose XYZ regulation to protect the environment or whatever it might be. And that all just sounds good to your average voter because they're not as engaged, they might not necessarily be as engaged as we are in the sort of issues, economic and regulatory, that we are. And then these things are imposed as if they have no cost at all. So taking it in the direction that you're taking it seems like a fairly encouraging way. But I'm interested in, as you've referenced there, the public reception to it. What have been the challenges on that front? Are people quite receptive to this, or has it been a bit of a fight?
Well, there's a few things going on. One is that for the most part, I've advocated this kind of law for as long as I've been in politics. And for the most part, the challenge has been getting anyone to pay any attention to it whatsoever.
Right.
As it turns out, there's a kind of group of conspiracy theorists, really, who have decided that this is somehow a plan to change New Zealand in some sort of way, which in fairness it is, just not the way they think. And so they've started doing mass submissions and trying to clog up the Parliament website and so on. So you'll get a little bit of that. And there'll always be people on both sides of politics who, a bit like, was it St. Francis of Assisi said, God make me chaste but not yet. They know that better regulation is critical to New Zealand's future, just not in relation to this very urgent and important initiative that they are currently advocating. So that's always a bit of a challenge, but ultimately If we can get to a stage where regulation faces the same level of scrutiny as taxing and spending, I believe we can massively improve our political culture and New Zealanders' welfare, because ultimately, the money that government taxes and spends, I mean, that damages overall welfare if they spend it poorly, heaven forbid. However, placing restrictions on the remaining property that people own, reducing the productive capacity and the ability to produce more wealth in the first place, I believe that is far more damaging than anything we've ever done to the fiscal situation in any country.
Mm-hmm. And the problems here are remarkably similar. There seems to be a bit of a growing movement in the UK at the moment. I'm not sure movement is the right word, but a growing appetite for doing something similar, for at least sort of asking sensible, reasonable questions about the regulatory burden. Our Labour government are currently doing it, in particular with our planning system, which you may know is a complete nightmare. And they are experiencing some backlash from people claiming that they're ripping up environmental regulations, etc. But I think it's significant, the fact that it's a left-wing Labour government who are normally relatively pro big estate and that sort of thing, that are taking it head on, because the problem has got so bad, because we can't build things very easily, and that's affecting our economy. So you talk about the conspiracy theorists, but are you generally optimistic that you will be able to deliver this, and do you think it will have the effects that you want?
Oh, I mean, it will happen. It's part of our government's plan and program, and it will happen by the end of this year. It will be in law. The issue is making it stick over decades. And I believe that is possible, but it's going to take several more years of work and adherence to normalise this way of thinking. And you can do it. You can get to the stage where now the independence of the Reserve Bank is completely unquestioned. The biannual publication of fully costed government accounts with forecasts up to 15 years into the future. I mean, that's uncontested. To stop doing that or to fiddle with that process would attract real political opprobrium. My goal is to get regulatory standards to the same level of public support.
Fantastic. Just one small question on one aspect of it as well. You're going to be setting up a regulatory standards board.
Yeah.
So this answers the question, I assume, who regulates the regulators? It's a meta-regulator, is it?
It is. I mean, if you concerned that an existing law or a new law does not comply with the principles, then you can actually make an application to the Regulatory Standards Board to publish an opinion on that. Now, again, that doesn't prevent anyone from doing anything. Parliament remains sovereign, can continue to make as many bad laws as people want to vote for, but what it does mean is that you have another reason for voters to be a bit suspicious of a particular initiative. They say, well, the Regulatory Standard Board says it's bad, maybe it's not such a good thing. And that, I think, is really worth putting in place. Otherwise, you get that everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die.
It's a really interesting idea, though, because again, just to draw the parallels with what's going on in the UK at the moment. Again, we've had a proliferating what people call the quangocracy, so quasi non-governmental organisations that are set up to sort of hold the government to account on things a lot of the time. But effectively, what you do is outsource government decision making to third-party organisations that, even if they aren't necessarily making the decisions, if a regulator or whoever props up during a government announcement that says, actually, this won't work very much, and that will really damage government. It does sort of tie the hands of government, but I guess this is sort of doing it in the opposite way, that it ties the hand of government doing things that will damage it further.
Yeah, well, bearing in mind that the principles are designed to protect people's right to live their lives freely so long as they're not harming others, and to use property so long as they're not harming others. I generally agree with you about the quangocracy comment. But I would also argue that if you go back to first principles and say, well, what does government do? It can spend and it can regulate the property it hasn't already taxed or borrowed against future taxes. Now, at the moment, we have a treasury. We publish really rigorous accounts. The government's also involved in currency. I know there'll be some libertarians say maybe you shouldn't do that, but for now it is. And we need to think carefully about, okay, well, what sort of infrastructure do we have? Some sort of quasi-constitutional law setting out the principles, some sort of enforcement mechanism for that. I think, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and regulatory policy are probably the three things that you do actually need some infrastructure around. Everything else is sort of a second-order activity.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I'd like to move from the regulatory to the fiscal slightly. There's a sort of internationally, and we talk about it a lot on this podcast, about what Musk is or was doing with Doge in the US, because there's moves to sort of replicate it here in various guises. What Malay's doing in Argentina in terms of cutting government spending. Now, is that what is your interpretation of what both of those approaches are doing, and what is your take on how important that should be? What are you doing in New Zealand about it, if anything, on that side of the ledger?
Well, I'm always cautious to not be critical of other countries and their policies and what their elected governments are doing. But certainly, I think it's true that right around the world, you can see various initiatives to try to reduce excessive government. My basic take is that people are very frustrated because for 80 years, politicians have said, look, you give us a third to half your income and we'll make all the problems go away. And people have paid the income and they've submitted to the regulatory state. And yet the problems, if you look at social dysfunction, people not getting a good education, people who are worried about their health and not getting the best treatment that's currently available in a timely fashion, people not being able to afford a house. Many of the problems, especially for younger voters, are, if anything, as big as they've ever been. And that's led to some real disillusionment for my part. I believe the government has become too complex for voters to monitor. They believe that it's not working in their interest, and so you get also a lot of populism around the world where people say, well, look, here's a simple solution. Whether it will work is open to question. And any initiative, I believe, that will strip away the complexity, go back to first principles. Why do we have a government? What things can we not do together that we must do together that requires the use of compulsion? And if you actually start from that point of view, the list is a lot shorter than you might imagine.
Mm-hmm. So what are you doing? What would you like to do? Obviously, you are in a coalition with two other parties, so hands tied to an extent. But what is your government doing? What would you like to do in an ideal world with that in New Zealand?
So, my party publishes alternative budgets, and our alternative budgets spend a lot less than the government that we're currently in. However, the government that we're currently in spends a lot less than it would be if we weren't in it. So that's the happy medium of coalition government. If you look at what our government is doing, we just brought down a budget in May which increased government expenditure by 0.9%. Now, we got inflation running at 2.5% and population running at something like 1%. So 3.5% increase in nominal GDP, I guess, and there's some economic growth in there too, actually. Then you look at what the government's doing, increasing at 0.9%. So, we are taking almost a point of GDP off our expenditure each year, and we've charted a course to do that. So we'll get from about 34% down to about 30% of GDP over the 4-year forecast. So that's pretty good restraint, particularly when you consider the demographic headwind that we face. So every year our pension costs increase by around about $1.5 billion. To put that in context, that's about a third of a point. So over that 4-year period, we'll actually have about 1.33 percentage point increase of GDP in pension costs. We're eating that and driving efficiency through the rest of government. So that's basically we're up to a sort of a long, slow tightening to try and get us back to sustainability.
It's interesting. You're going in completely the opposite direction to the direction we're going here in the UK. On that front, certainly pensions is one of the big unanswered challenges that we have in the UK in terms of how we actually are going to fund this going forward. What is that? What is the picture like for your pensions and welfare spending in New Zealand? And we're resting with it in the UK, but what's your approach?
Well, it's. I mean, in my view, it's far too high. I've campaigned to my great political cost to raise the age of entitlement to superannuation. I just don't believe that it's sustainable to keep paying a pension at 65 years of age. That can't continue. I believe that it's really critical that in New Zealand we begin to raise that age incrementally, and the sooner we do it, the easier it's going to be to make the books balance. So that's a critical change that I support, and I think it will come into favour as people see the reality. There's also people of working age who are in welfare, and that's about 1 in 6 New Zealanders. And I just refuse to believe that 1 in 6 working age. I mean, there's people with a disability. There are people who are temporarily out of work, and I think there should be something there for them. I think for people who are disabled, there should actually be more, frankly. But I refuse to believe that 1 in 6 New Zealanders are genuinely unable to work at any given time. It's just not the case. It can't be real. So we need to get a lot stricter on that. And then there's a massive amount of entitlements mainly for working families, but in reality those are a subsidy to employers, and I don't believe that that is a good way to continue. So certainly with welfare spending, transfers of cash to people as around about a third of all government spending and about 11% of all of GDP. That is a vast amount of money if you are one of the people who actually gets up and makes a difference in your life, because you end up carrying a disproportionate amount of that burden. So it's not 11%, it's not 22%, maybe a third of your money is going into transfer spending.
So that's just on a theme that we've mentioned a few times, but I'd like to dive into a bit more. The ability, what you need to do to have the ability to deliver this in government. What does it take to win over the public to these sometimes quite difficult arguments, raising the pensions age, cutting welfare benefits, cutting other things, introducing complex regulatory bills? What is it that has allowed you to take that platform into government as part of a coalition, but that platform into government and start delivering on it? And what could other countries learn from that?
Look, we've delivered some of this. We haven't delivered all of it. I think a lot of what drives people is actually experience and events. So people out there realize we're in tough fiscal times. The idea that we can just keep borrowing and spending, I don't think that passes the sniff test with the New Zealand voter anymore. People see this is quite an unusual New Zealand thing, but traffic management, temporary traffic management's got out of control. There's an industry of placing orange cones all over the road, and they've become iconic. In fact, there's a big fashion show called the Wearable Arts Award, which was actually won by a person dressed as an orange cone last year. So people are very, very aware that we have a regulatory problem, particularly young people looking at the housing market saying, where is my pathway to a property-owning democracy? It's the ladder's, choose your metaphor, I can't reach it. And I think what's happened is that the things we're talking about have come to have currency with voters because they recognise that if we just keep doing what we're doing, it's not going to end well.
That's interesting, because, again, very similar diagnosis here in many ways, but the housing crisis is one of them where I mentioned earlier the Labour government are trying to tackle some of the regulatory problems around planning because people really feel and have felt for a long time now about the challenges of getting on the housing ladder. We don't have quite the same comb problem as you, but that's quite an interesting example of when you have such a visible problem, that can really feed into a wider general ethos about things going wrong. So how bad do things have to get before they change?
Well,
have the appetite to change.
I think one of the real barometers for a pioneering society like New Zealand is, are people coming or are people going? We're in a period where something like 80,000 citizens left last year. If you want to get a sense of what that means, multiply it by 15, you get UK numbers. So that's what 1.2 million. If 1.2 million Brits left in a year, you'd be saying, well, there's something going wrong here. So we certainly, I think, are feeling the pinch in migration patterns, and that's when people start to look at, well, it's time for a change. A similar thing happened in the early 80s, 2% of people leaving. that was a real trigger point, and we seem to be at that stage again.
So that's how you get the sort of the voters on board. They see a problem, they vote for a certain type of change. When you're in government, how do you actually deliver it? Because in it, again, just to keep drawing the parallels, I've spent a little bit of time in government, not anywhere close to your own experience, but delivering through the civil service, but also through the courts and everything else, can be quite the challenge. Do you experience similar difficulties, and if so, how are you tackling them?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, for the most part, we've been quite well supported by our public service. For example, we designed the charter school legislation, got it passed, opened up the schools, and that's all gone pretty smoothly. To have, now 7 schools opened within our first 15 months in government, when there was no legislation to start with. So we've been able to do things quite rapidly. I do believe that there is a real problem with numeracy in the public service. It's often quite challenging. I understand that you've got really similar problems, that we can reproduce an alternative budget here in New Zealand quite easily by using publicly available statistics and altering it according to our policy changes. The same person that's done that has now done that for us in the past, living in the UK, tells me you can't actually construct that using UK data, which I found really surprising given the scale and the resource that the British government must have compared with New Zealand. So we're lucky in that sense. But I would say overall, our country, and I suspect yours, has a real problem with just a really busy org chart at the top. So if you look at our situation, we got a Prime Minister, a Deputy Prime Minister, then we've got another 26 ministers for a total of 28. We've got 2 undersecretaries. They, amongst them, have 82 portfolios. Many of those portfolios don't actually connect to a department. So we've got a minister for Auckland, which is a city, but there's no Auckland department. We have a minister for the South Island, but there is no South Island department. And we have some departments which nonetheless answer for as many as 23 different ministers. So you've got portfolios that aren't real. You've got departments that don't have any one person they're accountable to. You've got ministers that are spread across as many as 7 different portfolios. The ability for people to really drive change is very limited. Having one minister saying, you are the minister for police, you deliver policing services, that's really rare. For the most part, we've got everyone in charge of everybody and very little accountability, and that makes it very difficult to get change done. And
very difficult for public to see who's fully answerable and everything like that, I assume.
Yeah, and it also subtly changes the emphasis that a minister is there to solve a problem, like whatever problem the South Island has, for example, rather than a minister is there to guarantee value for money for a series of contracted outcomes contracted between the minister and the department. So it actually changes from an accountability framework to a sort of almost aspiration framework, and that does not get good value for money.
Interesting. And now, just to go back onto the policy front, I'd like to dive into something a little bit you mentioned there, that I'm sure our listeners would be really interested to hear about. Is the charter schools? That's some impressive progress in the first 15 months. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is and how it's going?
Yeah, look, basically, there are 2 unspoken rules in New Zealand education. One is that the unions dominate the agenda, and 2 is that you don't want to leave any capital on the table, so you must preserve a network, and if you've got a seat, there must be a bum on it. Doesn't matter if any learning's happening there, keep them there. We are trying to break those unspoken rules by saying, first of all, charter schools are outside of the public sector, so you needn't employ teachers on union conditions. That's been a real game changer, because it means that you can start paying for performance, you can start paying different rates, you can have your own contract. One school, for example, has a model which is driven by teaching assistants who are actually student teachers at the local university. Normally, they would be working some job to get themselves through uni that may be unrelated to education, And meanwhile, everyone's saying if only there was more on-the-job training. With their bulk funding outside the union contract, they're able to do that. And they've tripled the staff-teacher ratio, which is helping kids. Now, none of this is complicated. You just need the freedom to do it. So it's a very Hayekian worldview. And the second thing is, we've unlocked the school network issue by saying, look, we're giving you all your cash up front. You don't get given property. You have to provide your own property. You can lease back off the state, but so far nobody's done that. As the charter model grows, I suspect there'll be more pressure to do this. However, I believe giving this level of autonomy over your money, your employment status, your property, really does let 1,000 flowers bloom, and we're seeing that already, even though they've only been open for 3 months. So
I was about to ask that. What's the impact you're seeing so far in the early days?
Well, I think in fairness, you're talking about several hundred students across 7 schools, and we don't even have a baseline, so it's difficult to measure how they're going. But certainly, you can always fall back on anecdotes. I mean, people have actually moved cities to go to a charter school. Kids that hadn't attended school for months, even years, are now attending. So there's certainly some very good examples like that, but I wouldn't want to rest the whole policy on very promising anecdotes, but nonetheless anecdotes.
Well, that's great to hear. It's again parallels to what the UK did a few years ago with the Free Schools Initiative. Academies first, then free schools. But though is being there's a schools bill going through at the moment that is undoing a lot of that. A lot of that stuff is bringing government control back to a lot of the places that were purposely set up independently, and ensuring that teachers have certain qualifications, which again, it sounds great on paper, but
it's just always the way, isn't it? I mean, the prioritization of adults with good-paying jobs over the prerogative of providing children with an opportunity to live their lives on their own terms in the 21st century. It's just sickening, isn't it? The way that people will put their, basically union dues ahead of the future of New Zealand, and the arrogance of it. These unionists believe they have the right to do that at the expense of the taxpayer and, more importantly, the children. But anyway, it's a fight worth having.
Absolutely. Now, just before we wrap up, I'd like to do a little bit of what we've talked a lot about the parallels and the separate challenges between the UK and New Zealand. What do you think? What sort of 2 or 3 lessons do you think the UK and other countries as well could learn from what you're doing, and how to deliver it?
Look, I think what we're doing in regulation is genuinely exciting. We are putting in place, statutory principles, an enforcement mechanism. We've got a government that's up for it. We need to win another term to bed it in. But that can really, I think, change the relationship between the regulated and the state. I think what we're doing around resource management law, which we haven't discussed, we're replacing our planning laws with a law founded on property rights. So the objective of the law is to assist in the enjoyment of property. If you're going to object to someone else's property use, you have to show that that is founded in your own impairment of your property rights.
So let's go into that in a little bit more detail, actually, if you don't mind. We've got a little bit of time. That sounds extremely interesting, and something that completely different to how we approach it there. So just talk us through that in a little bit more detail. You can't protest somebody else building something unless it materially impacts on your own property.
That's the principle. So, New Zealand planning law has gone through a series of movements up until 1926, when some of the most attractive and expensive parts of New Zealand were built. There was no statutory planning law. Then, of course, we got the Town Planning Act, and then in 1953 they extended the misery to the country with the Town and Country Planning Act. 1977 that was overhauled, and in 1991 we got the Resource Management Act. Now, what's interesting about that timeline is that it's changed about every 30 years. And what's more, each time it's changed, the underlying law has been driven by the zeitgeist of the age. So in 91, we had the Resource Management Act, and this was the time of the Rio Conference. It was the time of sustainability. And so our underlying imperative in resource management is sustainability, to provide for current generations without taking unduly from future generations. No one knows how to do that. So we end up spending $1.3 billion, again, multiply that by a dozen or 15 and then halve it to get pounds. So it's a 10, 20 billion pound industry in planning in New Zealand, to try and interpret whether or not something is sustainable. No one knows the answer, so you just pay until people get bored and let you do something, or not, and the uncertainty is the real killer. Now, this time, we're introducing property rights because we're at a time where I think the zeitgeist as a whole generation feels hopeless and helpless. There's no pathway forward to a property-owning democracy. Too many people are told no, it's sapping our spirit. One story I often tell, I happened to go to the same school as Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first guy to climb Mount Everest, and I actually met him, and he's the most extraordinary New Zealander in my view. But the climbing walls where he, according to legend, learned to climb have now been closed off for health and safety reasons. So people see that this regulatory state is, it's not just making it more expensive to do stuff. It's not just stopping us. It's actually destroying who we are as a country. Arguably our greatest ever citizen couldn't happen in New Zealand as it is today. And that's why it's so critical that we imbue a new zeitgeist, which is that you have the right to property and do what you want as long as you're not harming others. And, of course, there'll be environmental standards, but those are fixed standards. You can't pollute the water more than X amount or whatever.
That's really interesting, and certainly something that we could learn a lot from, I think. Just a quick one before we end. What do you think New Zealand could learn from the UK, if anything?
Well, we've learned a huge amount. I mean, I've got to thank you for the Westminster Parliament, and,
sure, yeah,
the common law and the courts and so on. The language has been quite good. Your food's not so good. I kind of wish the French had got here first, in that case, Bob. Look, I look at the UK today, and I read The Spectator, and it seems that so much of what is happening is almost identical, sometimes within a few months. But what you guys have done in the last 15 years with your education, your free schools, your academies, your content-rich curriculum, you've actually started to go back up the league tables in terms of educational performance. That is going to set you up. You're also doing much better in school attendance, which I'm responsible for as Associate Minister of Education back home. And I think that's, ultimately the only real indicator of any society's future success is how much knowledge was transferred from one generation to the next today. You need a few things for that to happen. One, they actually need to be at school. So I think you're doing well there. We're learning from you on that. We've copied things directly, even in the last couple of years. Two, there's got to actually be knowledge to transfer in the curriculum, and so we're doing a lot on that. And three, I think you've got to have a bit of joy and a bit of engagement. And that's where, charters, free schools, academies, whatever you like to call them, I think can actually make building a good education system a deed of intellectual courage rather than, just being constrained by a system that is run for the capital works and the unions, which, no kids get excited about that.
Quite, and that's interesting. It's one of the schools program, certainly one of the go-to sort of what did a certain government do at whatever point in the schools program was always sort of quite far up that list, because it's somewhere where we increased liberty in terms of how a system is run and the benefits were evident. Well, David, thank you very much for joining us, for talking us through what you're doing. It's fascinating. We'll certainly be watching closely and hopefully learning from more of your hopeful successes.
Yeah, no, well, thank you, and good on you guys for the long history of good work at the IEA.
Well, we keep trucking.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. As always, if you want more from us, go to our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Until next time, thank you very much.